I'm Vinnie Politan. The subject of my investigation is the tragic mass murder of 4 innocent University of Idaho students. Their killer took a deal from prosecutors and admitted to his crimes. Here's the story. In the stillness of a November night in 2022, terror struck a quiet college town. 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were brutally murdered in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. Stabbed as they slept, their young lives were stolen in a crime so savage it shook the nation. There were no screams heard, no calls made until morning. 2 roommates slept through the massacre. A trail of mystery and horror followed. No forced entry, no suspects, no answers. Weeks of fear gripped the campus as investigators combed through DNA, surveillance, and digital clues. Then came a criminology PhD student arrested across the country, accused of carrying out the slayings with surgical precision. A knife sheath left behind linked him to the scene. The case shocked the country, brilliant futures cut short, families shattered, and the community left to wonder how evil could creep in so quietly. And now, that killer has admitted to his crimes inside a courtroom. And with the guilty plea, we now have the prosecutor in the case in court laying out the factual basis for what the prosecution and investigators believe happened. So it's really a sneak peek at what would have been the opening statement or part of the closing argument of the prosecution in the case. And during this hour, we're going to go through it section by section so we understand more fully what happened that night and what was going on with this defendant. Let's begin here as the prosecutor describes the actual killings of the 4 University of Idaho students.
The state believes that its evidence would then show that the defendant entered the residence of 1122 through the kitchen sliding door on the back side of the residence, which is the side of the residence that would face the area above where the defendant's car was parked. Defendant entered the residence, went to the 3rd floor, and with a knife, killed Madison Mogan and Kaylee Gonzalez. The defendant, as he left that room, for whatever reason, ended up leaving, or the sheath for a K-bar knife was left on the bed next to Madison Mogan's body. And I can jump ahead. That sheath was tested by the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab, and single-source male DNA was found on the snap of that sheath, as well as blood from both Kaylee and Madison and other trace evidence. But it's important to note single-source male DNA was on the snap of that sheath. The state's evidence would show that Xana Kernodle was still awake at this time. In fact, had taken a DoorDash order not long before this started. Her room was not on the 3rd floor. It was on the 2nd floor on the west side. As the defendant was either coming down the stairs or leaving, he encountered Xana, and he ended up killing her, also with a large knife. Ethan Chapin, Xana's boyfriend, was asleep in their bedroom, in her bedroom, and the defendant killed him as well with a large fixed-blade knife. Each victim suffered multiple wounds. I will state for the record that there is no evidence there was any sexual component or sexual assault on any of the victims. I want to make that clear so there's no speculation. There were 2 other roommates in the house, and they were already asleep. During the course of this, one of those roommates awoke, looked out her door not knowing what was going on, and saw the defendant, who was dressed in black with a black balaclava on, holding some sort of container in his hand. And she saw him leave the house through the direction of the kitchen where that sliding door is that I mentioned before.
Okay. Interesting description in the way that it happened, in the order in which it happened, which brings us to the first question in our investigation tonight. Were Maddie and Kaylee the targets? The description was pretty clear, that he came in and went directly upstairs. Here to help answer the question, retired FBI agent Stuart Fillmore and Brandy Churchwell, host of the 13th Juror podcast and Crime Junkie Jury. Thank you both for being here. Stuart, what are your thoughts here about the targets? You know, he's obviously knows something about this house and enters, they believe, on that sliding door and goes immediately upstairs.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I guess we won't ever really know why he did this, but I know in his paperwork he had to file his own factual basis, although I doubt there's going to be a lot of details in there other than he did it. But as far as were they targets or not, you know, I think there was video available of that house, like for listing purposes, and so he might have got some idea about the interior of the house from that. But, you know, it was a big risk. What I think ultimately this is going to be is you have a guy who was a PhD student. He had studied criminals, how they did their crimes, why they did their crimes. And what I think that he had decided, he had also studied Ted Bundy, seemed to have somewhat of a fixation on Bundy. I think he just thought he's going to recreate Bundy's attack on the Chi Omega house at Florida State University, only he's smarter than Bundy and he'll get away with it. And so he just, you know, that was what's in his mind. And I think he got into the house, he went up to the third floor and just worked his way down. Who knows why he stopped when he did. But that's what I think it was. But unfortunately, we'll just never know, I don't think, if he had specifically targeted someone in the house.
Brandy, the way the prosecutor described it, he went upstairs first, and then on his way down, Xana was awake, had gotten the DoorDash order, and confronted her and took her out next, and then took out Ethan, who was inside the room, and then left, despite the fact that Dylan seems to open her door, so there are more people in the house. What are your thoughts about Maddie and Kaylee being the specific targets of this killer?
You know, I honestly think that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they were his targets, specifically Maddie. If you kind of start from the beginning and work your way through the evidence and the events, you know, we know that this wasn't a random house, right? Kohberger followed these girls on Instagram. We've heard that he liked a ton of Maddie's pictures on Instagram. So, you know, for sure he could have been looking at what she was doing, where she was going, and things like that. We've also heard that he had pictures saved in his phone from Instagram of one of the girls and had sent multiple DMs to her trying to strike up conversations, but never got a response. He went to the restaurant, you know, potentially went to the restaurant where they worked and things like that. So that's all one thing. But aside from that, there's also the phone evidence. You know, his cell phone was hitting on the tower close to the house on King Road more than a dozen times leading up to that night. But I think the biggest piece of evidence that Maddie and potentially Kaylee were the targets is exactly what the prosecutor said today. He entered through that sliding door, which would put him in the kitchen area. There are two other bedrooms on that floor, and he passed directly by one of them and goes straight upstairs to Maddie's room. And then the sheath is, of course, found under her body, which suggests that's where the attacks began. And, you know, I think maybe he thought that she was going to be isolated up there. I don't think that he anticipated everybody else being in that house. You know, Kaylee had recently moved out. She was also driving a new car. So he may not have even known that she was in there. And, you know, by the time he got there, he didn't see the other roommates arriving back. I think that he parked on that hill to look into that upstairs room, thinking that he could see what was going on with her, you know, maybe look in the window or the door right there to look into her window. And I think that he thought she was going to be isolated, and he didn't anticipate all those other people. I think it got out of control and he had to, you know, get out of there quickly.
I think, Brandy, you make a great point, which about Kaylee had graduated early and had actually come back because she was so happy. She had purchased her first car on her own and was kind of showing her friends and reminiscing with them, getting ready to, you know, leave and begin her professional life and start her career. Stuart, so then coming down the stairs and encountering Xana and then Ethan there, my guess is they are potential witnesses at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something at this point, it probably forced his hand. You know, he didn't expect to find, you know, her there. But again, this is what doesn't make sense to me is, you know, all these kids were out late. They had been at parties. It could have easily, that house could have easily been full of kids that come back, you know, after being at partying. They, you know, it's not unusual they'd come back for an after party, which is great. That's what you should do when you're young. So yeah, he took a huge risk on this thing. You know, I know he'd circled around 2 or 3 times, and from different vantage points you can see in there, but he still ultimately didn't know who's in there. And so really probably when he encountered Xana, it's just something, you know, he had to do it. And at that point, you know, we learned today that Ethan was asleep. So who knows why he necessarily did that, but you know, but unfortunately, I keep going back to this. You know, I don't know that we're going to know this because he's not going to be forced to tell the truth on it.
Right. Not forced to explain exactly what happened and how it happened. Guests are staying with us. Coming up next, could they have caught him without the knife sheath?
That sheath was tested by the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab, and single source male DNA was found on the snap of that sheath.
We want to understand the mindset behind your actions in this case.
I'm going to give you a new scoop.
What happened?
I did it.
Very funny, really. I laughed. When you see me, I laugh.
I don't want any of this. You think you should get some kind of credit for not killing people?
Not at all, no.
You are a shrewd operator.
Interview with a Killer. Marathon starting Friday, 11:10 Central. Only on Court TV.
The state's evidence will show that following Sunday, November 13th, 2022, business records show that the defendant began searching for a K-bar knife and a K-bar knife sheath, as the state believes, to replace the one that was left at the scene of the murders.
The knife sheath, so significant in all of this. It's been a crucial piece of evidence from the beginning, and obviously the defendant, the killer, realized that and was trying to replace it afterwards, knowing that he left the scene without the knife sheath. I want you to take a listen to the prosecutor, who again was laying out so much inside the courtroom, here talking about the investigation and how they were able to track down the murderer. Take a listen.
Mr. Kohberger proceeded to finish his semester of studies at Washington State University and returned to Pennsylvania for the holidays. Law enforcement at this point were aware of Mr. Kohberger, had been accessing information about him, were trying to find him. They located him in Pennsylvania, and they conducted what's called a trash pull. During the nighttime hours, agents of the FBI, who assisted immensely with this case, working with the sanitation department back in this neighborhood in Pennsylvania, took trash that had been set out on the street for collection, sent the contents of that from the Pennsylvania residence of the defendant's parents to the Idaho State Forensic Laboratory, where the lab experts there were able to identify DNA on a Q-tip as coming from the father of the person whose DNA was found on the knife sheath that was next to Madison Mogen's body in the bed. Subsequently, an arrest warrant was issued here in Idaho, and a search warrant was issued in the state of Pennsylvania with the assistance not only of the FBI, but the Pennsylvania State Police. Mr. Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home to return to Idaho. Upon his return to Idaho, a DNA sample was taken from him, and it matched the DNA found on the knife sheath next to Maddie's body at the crime scene.
It was the DNA on the knife sheath. And that brings us to the next question in our investigation. Could they have caught him without the knife sheath? What if the murderer didn't drop the knife sheath or didn't leave the knife sheath behind with the DNA? Could they have caught him? Helping us with our investigation still, Stuart Fillmore and Brandy Churchwell. Brandy, what are your thoughts on that issue? Because we've been saying it all along. It's such an important piece of evidence. It was the piece of evidence that was going to lock down this defendant at trial. But what if they didn't have it?
Yeah, I mean, could they have caught him? Yes. Could they have proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt? That's a whole different ballgame. I mean, that knife sheath is the only kind of direct evidence, that they really have. So while it isn't the only evidence, it is huge for this case. I mean, without that, they have the videos of the white Elantra, that going back and forth. So I mean, that's really where everything starts. So, the video of the Elantra going back and forth speeds off right around the time the murders, are ending. They match the description, the bushy eyebrows, around the same height, that type thing. But all of that is highly, highly circumstantial. And they did definitely build their case from there. I mean, they have the following of the social media and the phone being in, the area. But even that, he, without that knife sheath, he could say, well, yeah, I drive out there all the time. That's nothing weird for me. You'll see that my phone's been there before. You would have the search history where he bought the knife, but you wouldn't have the evidence that that's the knife that was used. You have the evidence of the ski mask, but it's, it gets cold, it snows, you might need a ski mask. So I think without that, everything else is so circumstantial, and juries like a nice, clean story. And there are things about this that just aren't answered, that not calling 911 until the next day and things like that. And juries can really hold on to things, like that might not have huge significance to the actual case, but have questions in juries' minds. So without something like that that's so solid, I think that could definitely give enough reasonable doubt to acquit. So I think that was probably the biggest thing they have.
Stuart, how do they identify him without his DNA? They've got a car without a license plate. It's actually an out-of-state vehicle at the time, a Pennsylvania case. Do you think they're able to identify him and catch him without the DNA and all the DNA work that was done with the help of, by the way, your old agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yeah, Vinny, and I will say I've done a couple of those trash pulls before, and it can generate some very valuable evidence, but it's not a fun job to do. Yes, I think they could have found him. They could have identified him. It would have, it would have required, just old-fashioned police work, because you have the white Elantra, you have the DoorDash driver, remember? So that's a pretty good starting point. But it's still, you're going to have to eliminate a lot of different people and go through a lot of different things to do it. And I agree 100% with Brandy that, yeah, you have a compelling case, but without that knife sheath, I don't think you're going to get a conviction. I had a public corruption case one time that involved a possible murder that looked like a staged suicide. And there's a lot of compelling evidence around it. But in fact, the prosecutor said, I can easily get an indictment on this case, but I don't think we would win a trial. So I think it's the same thing here. The knife in this case puts you over the top.
Brandy, why do you think it was there? Do you think he left it on purpose, or do you think he lost it in the struggle? Did he panic? Was the adrenaline going too quickly for him? How do you think it ended up there?
I personally think that he lost it in the struggle. Like I mentioned earlier, I really don't think, and we'll never know for sure, but just me speculating, I really don't think that he thought that Kaylee was going to be in there. And the way that we've heard them describe that room, Maddie was on the outside, like the part closest on the bed to the door, and I believe Kaylee was on the other side. So I think that he didn't anticipate her being there, and I believe that, if she's fighting back, if she's, because the area where she was, she kind of would have been trapped. She would have had to try to fight to get away. And I think that in whatever happened in that moment, there was some kind of enough force for him to, for it to come off in some way. And also, it's his DNA on that snap part. So I feel like the only way it could have come off is if it came off during some kind of struggle in that room. And I think that he had thought he planned everything out, but didn't anticipate on things kind of going haywire like that. And so he tried to get out of there. And I don't think he even realized that he didn't have it until he was gone.
Stuart, what are your thoughts about how this happened? He left. This guy has been studying this stuff. He understands it. And he ends up leaving his DNA at the scene in the sheath that held the murder weapon.
Yeah, well, Vinny, as far as we know, at least, he had never murdered before. So, it's one thing to kind of fantasize about this stuff and play it out in your mind and do all this, reading about how criminals do it. But when you actually go to kill another human being, it's a completely different process. And again, I agree with Brandy that he probably didn't anticipate that Kaylee would be in Maddie's room. That added a whole layer of complications. And, and the other thing is the dog. The dog was in Kaylee's room. So, at the start of this, was the dog in there too? There's just a whole lot of factors, unfortunately, that I just don't think we're gonna know. We're gonna have to speculate about.
Big thanks tonight, Stuart Fillmore, Brandy Churchwell, 13th Juror Podcast, Crime Junkie Jury on YouTube. Thank you both so much. Up next, what was going through the killer's mind after the murders? I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation of the horrific, senseless mass murder of 4 young adults from the University of Idaho. Their killer was facing a trial and a potential death sentence, but he got a deal, so he admitted to his crimes. Here's the story. On the frigid night of November 13th, 2022, in the college town of Moscow, Idaho, 4 promising students were brutally slain in a crime that shattered the peace of a sleepy campus. Inside their off-campus rental home, Kaylee Gonzalez and Madison Mogen were attacked in bed, their lives stolen in a vicious assault. On the floor below, Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle met the same fate. Xana believed to have fought back with her dying breath. The killer moved with eerie silence, bypassing 2 other roommates who survived the night unaware. No one heard screams. No one saw a shadow. By the time help was called, the sun had already risen on a house soaked in horror. Panic gripped the town. Weeks passed before a 28-year-old criminology PhD student was arrested, linked by DNA on a knife sheath left behind. And now, this killer has admitted to his crimes inside a courtroom. And while he admitted to his crimes inside the courtroom, he did not himself speak and tell everyone what he did, lay out the factual basis of what happened here. There was a proffer done by the prosecutor, which really was a piece probably of his opening statement that he would have delivered at the trial, if there in fact was a trial here. So let's continue to listen to Bill Thompson, the prosecutor, talk about the case. And here he's talking about what happens after the mass murder.
At approximately 4:20 that morning, so this would have been 15 minutes or so later, the defendant's car is seen on a surveillance camera for 1112 King Road, which is immediately next door to the west of 1122, leaving the area at a high rate of speed. And if the court were to see that, or anybody in this courtroom would see that, you can see the car almost loses control as it makes the corner, heads north, and then turns to go south on Walinta, which is one of the only ways to get out of that part of town. The evidence would show that following that, the defendant in his Elantra drove south of Moscow. We know that he drove on the back roads because there are surveillance cameras on the main highways, Highway 95, that would have picked up the defendant's car if he'd gone that route. And they did not show the defendant's car on that route during the time. So we know that he went through a variety of back roads in very rural, isolated part of Latah County. About 4:48 that morning, the defendant's phone comes back on. And the evidence will show that that phone was located south of Moscow, likely at a side road intersection with Highway 95. From there, the defendant's phone activity tracks it heading back north towards Pullman, Washington, where the defendant lived. About 5:26, starting approximately 5:26, various surveillance cameras in Pullman, Washington pick up the defendant's vehicle as he enters Pullman from the south and heads north and slightly west towards his apartment, where he arrived at approximately 5:30 in the morning.
Some interesting parts of all that being described, especially the way he's leaving at a high rate of speed, almost out of control. And that brings us to the next question in our investigation. What was going through the killer's mind after the murders? Is he in control? Is he out of control? Does he have a plan? Is he improvising? What is he thinking about? Here to help answer that question, clinical and forensic psychologist Dr. Gary Brucato. He's also the author of a book you need to read, The New Evil. And Annie Elise, host of Serialously, I think I got it right, Serialously podcast. She's also the creator of the true crime YouTube channel 10 to Life. Thank you both for being here. Dr. Brucato, what are your thoughts about what could have been going through his mind after these murders?
Well, based on having spoken to and read the accounts of or interviews that have been done with many offenders who do similar things, we have a little bit of a clue what was probably going on. And there's evidence that also, in this particular case, that points us towards what may have happened. It seems that there are two things going on simultaneously. One is the pragmatic, which is sort of needing to get out of Dodge, being, sort of swimming in adrenaline, speeding away, possibly, nearly hitting somebody, in doing so, forgetting the sheath, coming back for it, all of that. But then there's this other aspect, which seems to have to do with a phenomenon that we see in serial type offenders, where the idea is that after an offense, the individual is now experiencing a kind of post-orgasmic feeling of relief and kind of excitement, where the person now feels that they're back on some kind of pedestal that they had been knocked off of in terms of their ego. And we see this, of course, in the thumbs up photo and the spring that he had in his step in the days after the murder, according to people who saw him at school afterwards. And that is very typical of people where the motivation has a kind of psychosexual quality to it, and it's all about that restoration of ego with a sense of domination and control over other people.
Let's take a listen to the prosecutor describe that moment you just talked about, Dr. Gary Brucato, involving the selfie and also him returning to the scene.
Later that morning, this Sunday, the 13th of November of 2022, Mr. Kohberger's phone returned to the area of King Road. We don't know exactly what he did, but it returned to that area. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning. He was there for about 10 minutes and then returned to his Pullman residence. About 9:30, the state's evidence will show, evidence taken from the defendant's phone, that he took a selfie of himself on his phone in what appears to be the bathroom of his Pullman apartment with a thumbs up.
Annie Elise, your thoughts about the actions of this killer after the murders?
I think that starting with the selfie, he clearly looks very proud. He has his thumbs up, he's smiling, he looks freshly clean, put together. But then following that, is where I believe we start to see the spiral, because not long after that, the information about the Elantra is released. And I think that starts to trigger some paranoia with him. Early on, we had heard about the social media account Papa Rogers, which was posting in the Facebook groups, posting about information that had not been released to the public at that point. One of the main posts being, could the killer have left the knife sheath behind? That was a detail nobody knew about yet. This was still before the end of the year. And so there was a lot of suspicion that he was the one who created that account, not only because the photo in the AI image looked like him, but because whoever this user was knew a lot of the information about the crime that had not been released. He hadn't even been arrested at this point. Come to find out, too, that he did, in fact, study under Elliot Rodger, the famous incel who went on a murder spree. So the account was believed to be some sort of ode to Elliot Rodger, because he does have, as disturbing as it is, a huge fan club out there of incels. So I think he's posting in the group, sussing out information. What do people know? Getting hyper paranoid. And then shortly after that, he cleans the car, disassembles it, as we heard today, cleaning every nook and cranny, putting evidence into bags, wearing plastic gloves in the middle of the night. And I think that's when he really started spiraling and realizing that he was most likely going to get caught for this. And fun fact that right when he was arrested, that Papa Roger account wiped, deleted.
Wow. Let me ask you, Dr. Brucato, the knife sheath, was that panic, or is there, because some people are wondering, could he have done this on purpose?
I think it's giving too much credit to this offender to think that he was some kind of mastermind that left things on purpose or all of that, because, of course, it makes a lot more sense that what really happened was that he gets probably interrupted, I think, by Xana, and drops it and goes after her, and then is now on the second floor. So I think it's important in the story of this guy to understand that he probably went in there with an intention that simply didn't get played out, because everything did not go as he had planned. It has been my sense for a long time that he went in there with the intention to target one victim, probably sexually, despite being extremely inadequate and probably not being able to carry out what it is he had fantasized about. But everything went haywire. And you've got Kaylee there unexpectedly. Xana pops in. He's chased downstairs. He certainly doesn't expect a male to be there. So then you wind up with this sort of extra anger toward the male, with this totally unnecessary time-wasting activity of cutting the hamstrings in this weird experimental way before he leaves. And I think that has a quality that we see in some serial killers, where despite that you need to be getting out of Dodge and it isn't necessary for the commission of the crime, you do this thing that's just titillating to you psychologically, that we call a signature, or that you just sort of do to try something out. I also think it's very, very interesting to point something out quickly.
Dr. Gary Brucato, can you hold that thought? We're going to take a short break. We've got another segment. Dr. Gary Brucato, Annie Elise staying with us. Still to come. Was the killer looking for a target or stalking a target?
Between July 9th of 2022 and November 7th, the defendant's phone connected to that particular tower during late night, early morning hours, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., on approximately 23 times.
We want to understand the mindset behind your actions in this case.
I'm going to give you a news scoop.
What happened?
I did it.
Very funny, really. I laugh. You see me, I laugh.
I don't want any of this.
You think you should get some kind of credit for not killing people?
Not at all, no.
You are a shrewd operator. Interview with a Killer. Marathon starting Friday, 11:10 Central. Only on Court TV.
911 location of your emergency.
Something is happening. Something's happened in our house. We don't know what.
What is the address of the emergency?
1122.
And tell me exactly what's going on.
One of the roommates has passed out, and she was drunk last night, and she's not waking up.
Okay.
Oh, and they saw some man in their house last night.
That heartbreaking 911 call, those poor kids. The prosecutor, we've learned a lot from the prosecutor in laying out some of the facts in the case, including what was happening before the murders, in the lead up to the murders. Take a listen.
Back in March of 2022, when the defendant was residing in his parents' residence or was residing back in Pennsylvania, his home state, he purchased online a K-bar knife and sheath with an Amazon gift card that he had purchased shortly prior to the purchase of the knife, sheath, and sharpener. Jumping ahead, the end of June of that year, the defendant, Mr. Kohberger, moved from Pennsylvania to Pullman, Washington, which is right across the state line from Moscow, Idaho, for the purpose of pursuing a PhD in criminal justice at Washington State University. The state's evidence would indicate that beginning July 9th of 2022, Mr. Kohberger's phone began connecting to a cell tower that serves the area of the 1122 King Road residence in Moscow, Idaho. Now, I will acknowledge for the court and all present that there are many residences in that area. It's a dense population of mostly college-related occupants. Between July 9th of 2022 and November 7th, the defendant's phone connected to that particular tower during late night, early morning hours, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., on approximately 23 times. Now, I will acknowledge also, we do not have evidence that the defendant had direct contact with 1122 or with residents of 1122, but we can put his phone in that area on those times. In the interim, on August 22nd of 2022, Lake Tahoe County Sheriff's Deputy Darren Duke conducted a traffic stop in the early morning hour or late evening hours, about 11 p.m. On the west side of Moscow, on the Moscow-Pullman Road. This was a traffic stop of Mr. Kohberger's car, which turned out to be a 2015 white Hyundai Elantra with Pennsylvania plates. During the course of the traffic stop, Deputy Duke was able to obtain Mr. Kohberger's name, Bryan Kohberger, his phone number, and his address, which at that point was an apartment address in Pullman.
23 times in 4 months in the neighborhood of the house where he committed the mass murder. That brings us to the next question in our investigation. Was the killer looking for a target or stalking a target? Still with us, Dr. Gary Brucato and Annie Elise. Annie, what are your thoughts on that? What is he doing there so often?
I think it's both. I think he was looking for a target when he bought the knife earlier in the spring, and then he moved there at the end of June, and just 9 days later is when the stalking began, the 23 pings in that 4-month period. So I think he was looking for one, and then I believe he found his target, Maddie, and began stalking her. In addition to the pings, we know that when he entered the King Road house, he went directly to Maddie's room, indicating he knew the layout, he knew where to go. We also heard that Kaylee's injuries were far more severe, which I'm not an expert, but in my opinion, that means there was a lot of anger. She got in the way of his plan. He was retaliating. We also heard today how when the prosecutor was speaking, they say he did enter the house with intent to kill, but that they were not going to represent that he intended to commit all of the murders. So I interpret that, again, as he went in there with the intention to kill Maddie, was surprised by Kaylee, surprised by Xana, surprised by Ethan, and had no choice but to commit the quadruple murder. But I don't believe that was the plan.
Dr. Gary Brucato, what are your thoughts there about all these trips that he's making in the lead up to the attack?
I think it's important to understand that the type of offender that I suspect this is, the fantasy-driven offender who kills for no reason other than psychosexual gratification, that type of person has in mind what I've called in literature and so forth, a prototype. That's the kind of original person who hurt you, or group of people who hurt you. And then you go out like a casting agent to find the person who fits the part. And we see that kind of trolling behavior in serial killers. On the Dateline episode that shared a lot of information about what was on his phone, for example, we see a lot of young women who are conspicuously similar in appearance to the victims, or certainly Maddie, who I think was central to this. It does appear that he had a certain prototype in mind and then honed in on a particular individual. This is intriguing when we think about, for example, his being inspired by somebody like Ted Bundy, who infamously killed scores of women who were often physically alike. Because over and over again, it's the killing of the same individual. As a fascinating point, when we think about overlaps with Bundy and mimicking and sort of copying his processes, I had a sort of eureka moment earlier when I was making an appearance on the Interview Room podcast, that today is the anniversary of when Ted Bundy's execution was vacated by the state of Florida for the sorority house murders. And so 39 years to the day after his potential hero, Bundy, is cleared, execution is taken off the table for a sorority house series of murders. We have this guy doing exactly the same thing. And this is one of those coincidences that is absolutely fantastic to me and almost makes you wonder how it could be a coincidence.
Right. Yeah. Is it a coincidence? You know, the timing of all this, that's such a great point. We have a couple minutes left here. Let me ask you, Annie, what lingering questions do you have in all of this?
I would like to know where the murder weapon is. I would like to know how he was able to leave without a trace of blood in his vehicle, although I know he cleaned it. What was he wearing? We know that after the fourth murder, he was exhausted and sat down in the chair before leaving. And so I would like to know those questions. And although I don't believe there is necessarily a why, I would be curious to hear from him his reasoning for why.
Yeah, Dr. Gary Brucato, do you think these are questions that will ever be answered by him? Because you know he's going to get the requests, and I don't know if the Department of Corrections will allow it, but he's going to get requests to speak, to interview, whether it's with law enforcement or with members of the media or public. What are your thoughts about learning more of these details?
Well, when we understand that virtually everything was done here was some variation on the theme of dominating, controlling, and manipulating other people to feel superior to them and compensate for insecurity. We know that the same thing is going to happen, as it often does with killers, when you go in and ask them stories about their fantasies and motivations and so forth. They enjoy fibbing to you, holding things back, making transactional bargains, getting attention, so forth. And so everything that is said just has to be taken with a grain of salt in terms of the details. But underneath those little fibs and exaggerations and so forth, there are these kernels, these themes that reveal that the individual is motivated in that way. I would say much of what he is probably going to say is going to be limited and manipulative, and the real fantasy stuff is going to stay forever in his brain for his own private enjoyment.
Dr. Gary Brucato and Annie Elise, incredible analysis. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. The victims' families will have an opportunity to give their impact statements at sentencing. Unfortunately, for some of these family members, the impact isn't just from the crimes. It's also from the way they've been treated along the way by those in charge of prosecuting the killer, and that is unconscionable. Getting re-victimized by the system. Their voices are important, and our system should go above and beyond to listen to them and to serve them. I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.